Hello, everyone. My name is Madeline. I'm here with my co-host, Kristiaan. We want to welcome you to our new podcast series, The Way Forward. First, a little bit about myself. 15 years ago, I came out of a high-control religion that I'd been deeply entrenched in for nearly 4 decades. I always had nagging, unanswered questions and a sense that what I stood for was beyond unethical. It felt abusive. But I do have a confession. Most of all, what drove me was this indescribable feeling of terror that, as punishment for leaving, I'd forever lose my conscious sense of being. To be, well, me, even though I had no idea who that even was. So following several years of flailing in no man's land, eventually I embarked on 2 parallel paths of learning. One through academia, where I completed a BA in psychology with focused interest in the cognitive and psychosocial domains, and the other of Eastern philosophy and love-based perennial wisdom. And to my astonishment, these 2 paths, one science-based and the other esoteric, were in complete harmony with one another. Now, I'm not qualified to give clinical advice. To do so would be unethical on my part. But I do hope to offer our listeners some illumination on the powerful dynamics that shaped our shared experiences. I can also recommend, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, which has proven extremely effective. But I understand as well that it's costly, the wait times can be very long, and it can be very difficult as well to find somebody with the expertise needed on subjects such as religious trauma. But meanwhile, if you understand some basic principles as to how the human brain operates and what shapes emotion and behavior, I believe this knowledge will help you to zoom out and to learn new ways to become more resilient, to cope, and to respond to life situations with deliberation and not merely react. So let me introduce you now to my co-host Kristiaan, who also comes from a conservative religious background. He holds a Bachelor of Arts with honors in psychology and psychometrics and double majored in philosophy. As a professional, he currently acts as a career coach, specializing in communication skills and relationship building dynamics. Kristiaan will be offering simple but highly effective frameworks by which to look at any given topic or issue and how to respond with confidence and measured control. I believe you'll find that his unique contribution has practical use across several domains in life, including communication skills within relationships, both personal and professional. And I can personally vouch for him because he also happens to be my husband. So, without further ado, hello, Kristiaan.
Hi, Madeline. Thank you so much. And I must say that I'm really excited about being part of this podcast. So, by way of starting, I would just like to make a few comments. I think it's important to understand that some of the subject matter might be triggering for some people. And I also want you to know that we're going to be playing with some ideas and the shaping of ideas to help us navigate through life. But I want to add that ideas themselves are never sins or mistakes. Think of an idea as you would think of a kite that you fly. You form an idea and you see whether it flies. And if it flies, it serves you well, right? And then all is well. And if the kite falls and crashes, well, the good thing is that you don't have to crash with it. It is merely the idea that perishes, and you can try again. So we're going to be playing with ideas and concepts. I want to comment a little bit about when I first met Madeline, and I was really not very well informed yet of religious trauma. Perhaps I hadn't even heard the term. And I noticed that sometimes I would make perhaps a careless or a dismissive comment about religion or about God, and I recall that she would flinch involuntarily. And I was watching basically a woman struggling with nightmares, low self-esteem occasionally, and perhaps a wound that was always just under the surface, ready to emerge. And looking back now, I realize fully that I was observing a self-protective mechanism kicking in, albeit maybe maladaptive. In fairness, I should acknowledge that although we all come from hierarchical expressions of religion, the hierarchical power structures in my home culture and conservative religion I grew up in are quite similar with others. For example, decision-making power being mostly centralized at the top. And with that comes the typical rise in status for some people, but relative invisibility of those who align under those power structures. And consequently, for me personally, it took my own deliberate journey to reach the various steps of what I would call self-governing adulthood. The obvious linkage of interest between Madeline and myself is that we're both intensely interested in the dynamics of how relationships are formed and sustained, and importantly, the differences between healthy trust-based relationships and those that are pathological in nature. I will be introducing thinking structures in our podcasts that will aid in understanding situations, what their drivers are, the likely outcomes, and I guess most importantly, your agency and your abilities, wherever they lie, to change the scenario and change who you are in that conversation.
Thank you, Kristiaan. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to be exploring a series of topics that I believe you'll find extremely relatable, including our sense of self, our identity, and what does a healthy sense of self look like? As well, what is happening when an individual loses their identity to a group? This is also known as identity fusion. As well, concepts such as learned helplessness, or what we call the victim mentality, versus internal locus of control, meaning that you have self-agency over your inner state of being. That would be your emotions, your thoughts, and your outward behaviors, rather than being at the mercy of your external environment. And remember that when I say environment, this is not limited to a set of physical circumstances, but this includes, for instance, your relationships and the dynamics within which these relationships operate. So today, as part of an introduction to our series, we'll briefly discuss spiritual abuse. So we were told to trust our spiritual leaders and to mistrust the world. And to do so meant that we had to switch off our inner GPS. So we didn't learn people. We didn't learn each other. We certainly didn't learn ourselves. And the broader society at large, the place where we find ourselves now, has become a minefield of uncertainty. The question remains, how do we recognize the impact and behavioral responses from the environment we came out of? How to recognize abusive power in its many forms? And what are some healthy ways of responding that we can learn and apply? So what is spiritual abuse? What is the typical profile of the abuser? And what are these harmful effects? Because if we learn to spot the typical characteristics and patterns, we can begin to avoid pitfalls over here on the outside where we are now.
You know, Madeline, I just want to jump in here quickly and perhaps just add something to what you said there. It is important to realize that spiritual abuse occurs across a spectrum of experiences. It is not just one thing. You know, one person might find themselves under active coercion by a religious organization where they're currently involved. And another person might be contemplating emancipating themselves, and yet another person might have started the emancipation process, or they might already be completely outside the organization but not free from its grip. So this is analogous to somebody immigrating to another country and another culture. In our case, an unknown demographic of society, the worldly people, and it is much like an immigration experience. The new culture in which you want to immerse yourself and become functional and flourishing contains so many blind spots everywhere. I think people really struggle with this because this includes issues such as having natural, interested, and interesting conversations with others. It also deals with doing a job on a daily basis, yet having to deal perhaps with people from your past, in the interim, in the evenings, etc., carrying worries in your mind, yet having to relaunch your life on the so-called outside. So I just wanted to add that in. So you should see on the slide, it's called Spiritual Abuse and Overview. You know, very often people are confused about the issues between religion and spirituality. And although they are essentially distinct ideas, leaders in both those cases can often exert control over their followers. They are, by nature of their position, very, very influential. And so there's a significant overlap between spiritual abuse, religious abuse, and adverse religious experiences. And this often results in what we call religious trauma. So if you want to look for 3 maybe markers of spiritual abuse, what we've done is we've put just summary notes together on the left of the slide here. And it comes down to the fact that individuals in need of support and spiritual empowerment are being mistreated or poorly treated. And that results in the weakening of their spiritual well-being. Now, you've got to understand the second point here. Positional power is very, very important to leaders in this kind of situation. So their positional power allows them to dominate, control, and misuse that spiritual authority. We'll talk later a little bit about how positional power is important and perhaps even why it is important and how people gain that positional power. Now, the third point, religious trauma, could be called the damage inflicted from indoctrination, including when one leaves an authoritarian religion. And as many of you would know, authoritarian religions sink their hook so deeply into its adherents that even after you're leaving, you're still bleeding. And I think what we'll do now is we'll move on and start this discussion in greater depth. Madeline?
Yes. So in this next slide, we're going to paint a picture for you. First of all, imagine the nouveau riche. It's the person who's come into wealth and suddenly thinks it's appropriate to be condescending to restaurant staff, for instance. Or think about the young officer. He's suddenly given a badge and a gun. Or that young newly appointed elder that now has the power to reprove or disfellowship for not listening to counsel, even on so-called conscience matters. Or how about this one? The preemie wife whose husband has left the organization and now she puts on her slingback heels. She sashays off to the Kingdom Hall where her status has now shifted. She's now the spiritual widow, propped up as morally superior, and positions herself accordingly. She weaponizes newly found status to treat her husband condescendingly and to undermine him, even his role as a father.
You know, I just want to jump in there quickly. It is so obvious, and perhaps many of you have seen this in your own lives. People that have never adapted to feeling what it feels like when you have agency, when you have a say, when you have an actual voice that real people will listen to. Once they obtain that power, they will claw and cling to it, and they will exert it in a fashion that is not necessarily fair to others. It is just that they want to hold on to it because it is perhaps an intoxicating feeling. And at the same time, it puts them in good stead with the so-called powers that be. So on this slide, I want us to have a bit of an active look at abusive leadership. What do the range of abusive styles have in common? It often comes down to a few things. Unearned valor coupled with limited expertise. So what that means is the person is put in a position yet they are not necessarily a specialist in any specific area. And what comes with that power is sanctioned executive influence or sanctioned forms of abuse. So positions of authority within hierarchies are really necessary for things to function, and that is natural. But when they are only there to exert dominance, the recipients of that leadership don't flourish, because dominance is the purpose rather than that of nurturing. I want to add a quick tip for you, and this is not really my original thought, but the great psychologist Carl Jung would say that to understand somebody's behavior, you must understand what they're getting out of it and how that behavior serves them. And there's another issue. Remember that of any social interaction that you have with another individual, you constitute literally 50%, and that is really not insubstantial. You have much more agency than what it feels like in the moment. It means that they are as dependent on you and your response and that conversation as you are on theirs. Otherwise, they would not be interacting with you. They need this. And we'll return to this topic later, because that's going to deal with how to boost and increase your own agency and confidence in interactions that are not pleasant. Now, power dynamics can be used as a strategy to establish your place in the world. In functional relationships, the pinnacle value could be trust and reciprocation, giving back to each other, trusting each other, collaborating, etc. Versus in dysfunctional relationships where the pinnacle value is power and dominance. And this expresses in different dysfunctions, but always institutes an imbalance of power. For example, this is where the saying of "he who cares least wins" becomes a negotiation strategy, a relationship management strategy, or a bullying tactic. It is a matter of my way or be punished. And, unfair, cruel punishment is important because it reinforces fragile, tenuous power positions that are unearned, and therefore they must be fiercely maintained. And I'm sure you've often seen this in your own case or in your own life. The dominant person is not rewarded because of competency or inherent capabilities or emotional IQ. They are rewarded for other reasons, basically coming down to the whole dominance motive. In a nutshell, I could say that power base becomes pathological and transactional when the relationship is not a whole or a trust-based one. In rigid hierarchical structures or cultures, the status that is awarded is also linear to the size of your voice and visibility, whether people want to listen to you, look at what you do, follow your example, etc. And the lack of status, conversely, reduces your worth, your voice, and your ability to act within a group.
Something else to consider in the examples that we showed in the prior slide is the outcome remains the same, no matter the amount of trying on your behalf. It is designed to have a predictable outcome, to always favor the one holding the power. And this also happens to be a very good test as to whether or not a relationship is healthy or dysfunctional.
Great point, honestly. So I would like to just chat with you a little bit about the contents of the slide here. You can see that we have summarized abusive leadership as the characteristics unearned valor with limited expertise, that toxic combination, and also it includes sanctioned forms of abuse. And that is terrible because, if an organization is allowed to abuse you and also sanctions the abuse by their representatives of you, you are totally, totally powerless. That then is a little bit of background about abusive leadership itself, but I would like to chat with you about typical tenets or characteristics of abusive leadership style. And this is really the key domain of religious abuse. There is both subtle and overt misuse of power and authority. Sometimes people can interact with you in a seemingly kind and caring manner, but there is still power at play. There is manipulation and elitism, basically the elitism that goes with the power. There are very often toxic teachings that are more aligned with getting you to behave than getting you to grow and free yourself. And of course, the entire system bolsters the leverage of power. Now, the targets, who are the people that are typically targeted? Well, you look for the weak, right? You look for people that need you more than you need them right now. So they're going to be people that are socially vulnerable or individually vulnerable. They're going to be people that are in some kind of need of support. And the other one is people that are already part of that organization and they're choosing to leave. They are on thin ice and they're yet more vulnerable again. So those people are typically the soft targets. And organizations such as these tend to specialize in targeting them. And then finally, the victim can be re-traumatized from being silenced and victim blaming. And so that weakens spiritual well-being. People start doubting. They start doubting their faith. They start doubting their own motives, etc. And there is more and more literature about folks suffering from PTSD and PTSD-like symptoms when they have lived under fear and shame and guilt over a long period of time, even to the extent that it manifests in physical health impact, including many chronic disorders. And here I'm talking about anything from elevated blood pressure to heart conditions, but also pain disorders, and you get skeletal chronic disorders. You also get inflammatory disorders that are clearly associated with unresolved stress over a long period of time.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to move on to the next slide, the role of abusive leadership in religious trauma. Now, Kristiaan already went over these points in great detail, but I do want to draw your attention to that first one, that spiritual institutions with poor accountability systems attract people seeking control and power. And I want to mention that this segues into a future episode that we're going to be doing very soon. We're going to delve into a more focused topic, and that is authoritarianism. I felt this important because we came out of a religion that attracts authoritarian type personalities. On one hand, those who crave power, and then conversely, those that crave strong leaders. And this environment, it nurtures and bolsters authoritarian characteristics, and they employ textbook tactics by those in positions of leadership. So I felt this topic to be of sufficient importance because it had profound effect on our parents, their style of parenting, and by extension on our own parenting style, our communication style, and our relationship style.
So, Madeline, I believe we're at the point now where you want to share with us a tool that helps us have a look at the experiences that we've gone through and what their impact are on us. So please take it away.
Kristiaan, let's move on to our next slide. It's called Religious Trauma Syndrome, otherwise known as RTS. Wanted to point out a couple of things here. This work is based on Dr. Aria Baker. We're going to link the article called Spiritual Abuse and Harm Screener and its Revelations. We'll put that at the bottom or make sure that it's linked in the video description for you if you want to take a closer look at it. But a lot of this article is based off the work by Dr. Madeline in her book, Leaving the Fold. Some of you are probably very familiar with this book. She describes the long-lasting impacts of authoritarian religious environments, and PTSD and complex PTSD being among many different psychological outcomes from this type of trauma. And again, let's make a distinction too. There's religious abuse, there's spiritual abuse, but then religious trauma syndrome would be the unofficial diagnosis that describes the damage that has resulted from this abuse. So it's being legitimized by colleagues in the domains of psychology, psychiatry, and this brings us to our next slide, where we're going to look at the spiritual abuse and harm screener. Now, this is also in the article, but we're going to add a link to this as well, so you can go there directly. It's a tool to help identify these various types of spiritual abuse and their level of severity. It mirrors this growing acknowledgement of institutional abuse, and it really impresses the need for clinicians to address these complexities and the resultant harm, including PTSD, complex PTSD, and these other forms of physical consequences too that Kristiaan spoke of earlier. So some of the questions that will be covered, if you're interested in taking this, and I encourage you to look at it, it'll cover controlling leadership, embracing violence, the system that needs to be maintained to bolster and uphold these positions of abusive power. Gender discrimination is a big one. And then harmful God image. This one right here alone, that would take an entire episode that we could delve into. Let's just look at a few examples, because I think that many of these are really going to resonate with you. For instance, does my behavior, is it excessively monitored by my leader or group members? You know, my leader, he explicitly claims to speak for God. And I'm expected to follow all these rules, personal rules about sex, dating, marriage, scripture being used to justify parent-child behavior, or the leadership protecting abusive individuals, even elevating them to higher statuses of position. You'll see pressure to stay in an abusive marriage, or feeling ashamed for having doubts or questions. Then, of course, the big one, being shunned from our group, from our families, from our support system, our entire community and network. And on top of that, being expected to forgive the abuser, even while the abuse was ongoing, and then being blamed for the abuse that we suffered. But I do want to give a word of caution regarding this self-assessment. Some of the content, as you can see, may be triggering, and it needs to be made very clear that this is only a tool. It's meant to provide knowledge, self-awareness, and to help you identify various influences in your life and the impacts that they've had. This tool can also help your therapist or your counselor by adding a framework or a structure to your experience. But always keep in mind, please, that these are not labels by which to self-define. This simply provides you a vocabulary for your experience. So nor is it a solution. Blueprints will never build a house or a bridge or a city. It takes work. You know, we are the product of these dynamics, and yes, we felt like collateral damage. And the reality remains that we can only change what we can control. Therefore, change starts in you and in your response to your environment. You are the catalyst for change. And through self-education, we can identify, we can course correct deep-seated thought patterns that still unconsciously influence not only our thinking and behavior, but also our self-value and how we believe others should value us. So let it be that our trauma ends here with this generation, so that our children, our grandchildren will benefit from our healing. Remember that our thoughts, our words, actions, and our emotional state, these all have a profound effect on others. But this dynamic is also twofold, in that by this very process, we're teaching others how to treat us. So let's harness this. Let's work to create, for those who will follow us, a model or a template, if you will, of what is possible, what healing and what deep generated happiness and inner peace really look like. So we looked at this tool that we can use as an identifier, but we want to leave you with something of practical value as well. So let's go on and talk about how the brain responds when faced with threatening or stressful situations. Okay, So all living organisms are designed to conserve energy. The human brain consumes about 20% of your daily caloric requirements, and it's designed to do so in the most efficient way by allocating mental processes by matter of prioritization. And one of the ways this is accomplished is through pattern detection. You see, our brain is exquisitely designed to detect patterns. And this is how we make sense of our environment, how we navigate an unpredictable, uncertain world. Patterns, they help us form what's called heuristics. These are a sort of mental flow chart that acts as a shortcut for our thinking. For example, so we know better than to walk down a strange dark alley without even having to think it through. You already recognize the likely pattern, and thus you can predict the probable outcome. And this is all automatic. So these heuristics, they're an adaptive process. They're to be self-preserving. They are your guardians and your protector from danger and loss. And this includes your very physical and emotional safety. However, these can become so entrenched and rigid that the person stagnates, especially when their threat radar is constantly turned on. So those thought patterns are informed by the emotional center of the brain, what's called the limbic system. And the conclusion is already determined within a fraction of a second. And I really believe this is important for us to understand so that our expectations are realistic for our loved ones who are still deeply entrenched, for ourselves as well, to know this is the animal that we're dealing with, folks. So please be patient and kind with yourselves and with your loved ones who are still in. This is the most important point that I want you to take away. You can develop new thinking strategies to replace those old inefficient heuristics. These will be more conscious and deliberate rather than reactionary. Kristiaan's going to take over here and he's going to discuss a practical model that helps us to understand what happens under stressful conditions.
Thank you, Madeline. So, in the course of my work, whenever I coach people, I often talk to them about this phenomenon. I call it the psychophysiology of stress, meaning basically something happens to your body, but also to your mind whenever you encounter a stressful situation. So as the slide shows here, you are in a pressure-filled situation at the top. Now what happens is everything that you see in the orange oval, you experience the pressure, you become vigilant or hyper-vigilant, so your radar is up for anything else that can go wrong. Because this is how we are designed. We are designed to survive first and foremost. Now your body gets into the game and actually confirms for you that you are in trouble. And it does that by raising your heart rate, your blood pressure rises, you flush, your palms sweat, you get these butterflies in your stomach, etc., etc. And all of that is basically what I would call a noise cycle. What I mean by a noise cycle is that there's going to be internal dialogue in your mind. You're supposed to be acting. You're supposed to be calm and well composed under this pressure, but you are not. Because basically the part of your brain that deals with survival and getting out of that situation is utterly noisy, and it basically lights up like a Christmas tree. Your higher executive functions, like chosen behavior and how you think about the issue and how you articulate an idea, those are put on the back burner. So this is an enormous topic, and we will, throughout our deliveries, come back to elements of this. But right now, where I want to take you is one element of logic and language, and it has to do with how you think and how you speak, or how you thought and how you spoke in a stressful situation. So we want to share with you a tool that will help you analyze situationally what you went through and what you might be able to do differently going forward. And this leads us right into a little tool that I want to share with you. A little bit of background first. It is said, not by me, but by people smarter than myself, that writing is formal thinking. So if you take a situation and you journal about that, not long, exhaustive stories, but you make some key points about an experience that you had faced, it becomes much easier to break that experience up in its contributive parts. So the tool that I often use with my clients is for them to reflect back on a situation that caused them some form of discomfort, unhappiness, sadness, negative emotion, etc. And I'm providing to you here a template. It's called self-reflective situational analysis. So it's very situation specific. And there are 5 elements, and the acronym, as you can see there, is SPARK, to spark new thinking, etc. First of all, what you do is on a piece of paper, you remind yourself quickly of the context. And that is something like, when was it? Where was it? Who are the people involved, the various actors? And what caused that interaction between you and the other players? Then you go into the pressure point. What is it that caused you a sense of unease, a sense of unhappiness, or even stress? And see if you can break the problem into its parts. You know, what were the main complicating factors? So you might find 2 or 3 most important issues that made you feel pressure. For example, my spouse just came back from the Kingdom Hall and they were in a huff about something that I said or didn't say, or an action that I took or didn't take, and now they're on my case. Additionally, my children were right there to hear them tear a strip off of me. So break it out into the elements that contributed to that point of pressure that you felt. Now go and reflect back, and here you really need to be honest with yourself. What are the things that I did at that time? I felt like crying. I felt like running away. I shouted back at them. I ignored them. I gave them a curt answer. I tried to explain my point of view to no avail. So, did I merely react as usual, or did I respond intentionally? You can ask yourself that. Did I try something new? What was my main response? And how was it delivered? Here I'm talking about tone. So you can really get into detail and be honest with yourself about your response and how it measured up to how you thought you could have responded. Then you can write up the outcome, and that's the result. Because in this element, I want you to start recognizing whether you've simply followed a heuristic, whether you simply followed a typical pattern, and then you thought that if I follow the pattern again, but I just try harder or I shout louder, that there would be a different outcome. So what was the outcome? How do I feel about that outcome? And try to list your emotions accurately, give them names, such as, I feel deflated, I feel defeated, I feel sad, I feel enraged, I feel like I want to run away. Now comes the really, really important part. Without this, the entire analysis is not really worthy. You've got to reflect on what your key takeaways were, and you've got to give yourself a commitment to change. This is a call to action, and you want to provide some structure for yourself for upcoming challenges, because you will face similar scenarios over and over. Write it in this way. If I could, what is one action that could have changed the outcome? One action by me. Remember, you can't control other people. This is about an action that you could have taken by choice. Choose an action that could have left the relationship in a better state. Or if I could, what could I do in terms of avoiding a destructive course of action? If I could choose any of these, what would that be? And try to be as articulate as possible. So, for example, I might say that whereas I used to say to my spouse, well, you just don't understand me and you always just want to tear a strip off of me, perhaps if I could change something, I might say to her, you know what? I know that this is very important and I know that you feel very strongly about this. Can you and I go for a little walk, and then I'm really going to listen to what you're saying. And let's have a conversation that is dignified for both of us. Folks, when you adjust your response to an attack, when you adjust your response to somebody else's input, you're teaching them, slowly but surely, how they need to treat you in future. People adjust remarkably quickly when they see that there is a new line in the sand and that you value yourself.
I realize that this is a lot of information. It's a long episode because we're introducing a lot of new concepts that we're going to be returning to frequently in the episodes to come. But I would like to leave our audience with this. We believe that our thoughts, our memories, and our future projections based on our life narrative is who we are. This isn't so. Those conscious thought processes that you think are the real you, this is what's called your ego. Think of it as your avatar. And I'm sad to tell you that human behavior is disappointingly predictable. You see, your conscious thoughts represent only 5% of who you are. The other 95%, that's a subconscious program. It's like a life script. It's running in the background. But we spend our entire lives unaware of the subconscious drivers that inform our emotions, our behavior, the choices we make, as well as our own sense of self, our self-worth. You can learn to hack this system and take control. And then once you realize how powerful you really are and the effect that you have on others, what you do with that power will be a testimony as to your true character. Will you use it toward personal growth, to ease the suffering of others? Or will you weaponize it and use it to subjugate others? Please choose wisely. And finally, remember, you really do have everything within you needed to be whole and to be well. It is your birthright. Claim it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Madeline. It's been really good to chat with all of you. You be well, and we'll see you soon again.
Yes, until next time, thank you, everyone. Take care.